When empathy is born from vigilance, there is a truth about sensitivity that most people avoid because it unsettles the comforting story we like to tell about ourselves. We prefer to believe that empathy always grows from love, that the ability to read others is a gentle gift, a sign of natural warmth. But that is not always the case. Sometimes what looks like compassion is something far older and far more defensive. There exists a form of empathy that is not freely given by a safe childhood or a stable environment. It is forged under pressure. It is shaped in uncertainty. It develops in rooms where emotional weather could change without warning. This is not the empathy of ease, it is the empathy of adaptation. If you recognize in yourself the ability to sense tension before anyone speaks, to notice the smallest change in tone, to feel the emotional climate of a room almost instantly, you must ask yourself an honest question. Did this capacity grow because you felt welcomed and secure? Or did it develop because at some point in your early life it was safer to anticipate than to trust? The psyche is remarkably intelligent. When a child grows in an atmosphere where love is inconsistent, where approval is unpredictable, or where anger may erupt without clear cause, the unconscious does not remain passive. It sharpens perception. It trains the senses. It cultivates what we might call hyperattunement. This hyperattunement looks from the outside like extraordinary empathy. The child becomes skilled at reading micro-expressions, subtle gestures, slight pauses in speech. They learn to detect what is unspoken. But psychologically, this is not pure empathy. It is vigilance wearing the mask of empathy. And this distinction matters deeply. True empathy involves the capacity to feel with another while remaining anchored in oneself. Vigilance, however, is driven by survival. It does not ask, "How can I understand you?" It asks, "What do I need to know to stay safe?" When such a child grows into adulthood, this pattern does not simply disappear. The nervous system remains trained to scan. The psyche continues to gather emotional data, often without conscious permission. You may find that after social interactions you feel inexplicably drained. Not because the conversation was intense, but because beneath the surface you were monitoring everything. You were not just listening to words. You were tracking tension. You were noticing inconsistencies. You were absorbing atmospheres. Over time, this creates a subtle but chronic fatigue. The mind becomes saturated with impressions that were never meant to be carried. And here we encounter the first paradox of what I call the trauma-born empath. Such individuals often withdraw from the world, but not because they lack love for humanity. Quite the opposite. They feel too much of it. Their solitude is not rejection, it is regulation. There comes a point when the psyche recognizes that constant emotional exposure is unsustainable. Without boundaries, perception turns into erosion. The individual begins to step back, sometimes gradually, sometimes abruptly. Crowds feel overwhelming. Certain relationships feel heavy. Even intimacy can become exhausting. From the outside, others may interpret this withdrawal as coldness or aloofness. But psychologically, something more profound is happening. The unconscious is attempting to restore equilibrium. It is saying in its own quiet way, "You cannot continue to merge with every emotional current around you. You will lose yourself." This is where many people stand at a crossroads. The trauma-born empath possesses remarkable perceptive ability. They can see beneath surface behavior. They can sense unspoken conflict. They often understand others more deeply than those individuals understand themselves. Yet this gift carries risk. Without integration, empathy becomes self-erasure. Some respond by numbing themselves. They shut down their sensitivity entirely. Others remain overwhelmed, trapped in cycles of emotional exhaustion. Only a small number begin to realize that the issue is not empathy itself, but the absence of psychological boundaries. To perceive does not mean to absorb. To understand does not mean to carry. To see does not mean to merge. Yet, for someone whose early safety depended on merging, This lesson feels almost threatening. As a child, separation was dangerous. Attunement was protection. The survival strategy became embedded in the unconscious. So as an adult, a tension emerges. One part of the psyche longs for connection. Another part longs for distance. You crave intimacy, yet prolonged closeness feels suffocating. You wish to help, yet you feel depleted by others' needs. This is not weakness. It is the psyche renegotiating its boundaries after years of overextension. At a symbolic level, this pattern reflects what Jung might call the archetype of the wounded seer. Throughout mythology, we encounter figures who gain heightened perception through suffering. They see more than others, but their vision isolates them. Their awareness grants insight, yet it distances them from ordinary belonging. The trauma-born empath often lives this archetype unconsciously. They perceive contradictions others ignore. They sense hidden motives behind polite interactions. They feel the emotional dissonance beneath social harmony. And this clarity can create a profound loneliness. Not merely social loneliness, existential loneliness. You may be surrounded by people and yet feel that no one truly resonates with your inner experience. It is not that you lack relationships. It is that you lack recognition at the depth where you live. And here lies the essential challenge. Solitude can restore you. But prolonged isolation can also harden into withdrawal. The task is not to eliminate sensitivity, it is to transform it. Individuation, as Jung described it, is not about becoming less feeling. It is about becoming more differentiated. It is the ability to remain aware of others without dissolving into them. For the trauma-born empath, this requires a profound shift in identity. You must move from the unconscious role of emotional guardian, the one who stabilizes everyone, to a more autonomous center. This shift is frightening because it feels like relinquishing protection. The unconscious whispers, if you stop scanning, something bad will happen. But adulthood offers tools that childhood did not. Choice, boundaries, autonomy. When empathy evolves from survival into conscious insight, something extraordinary becomes possible. You can feel deeply without being consumed. You can perceive clearly without isolating yourself. You can engage with humanity without sacrificing your psychological integrity. This transformation is rare because it requires courage. The courage to release patterns that once protected you but now limit you. The courage to endure a period of restructuring. The courage to stand alone long enough to discover who you are without constant emotional merging. If you find yourself in this stage of withdrawal, understand this. Your solitude is not failure. It is recalibration. The psyche is rebuilding its boundaries. And within that reconstruction lies the potential for a self that is no longer defined by survival, but by consciousness. When you are ready, we will continue into the next phase of this transformation. The loneliness of clarity and the reclaiming of the self. As this inner transformation progresses, something subtle yet unsettling begins to happen. The very sensitivity that once connected you to others starts to create distance. Not because you care less, but because you see more. At first, this feels like disillusionment. You begin to notice patterns in conversations that once seemed ordinary. You sense when someone is speaking from fear rather than conviction. You detect the hidden negotiation for approval beneath polite exchanges. You feel the tension between the persona a person presents and the unresolved conflict they carry within. And once you see these layers, you cannot unsee them. This is the stage where the archetype of the seer becomes more conscious. In myth, the seer is rarely celebrated during their lifetime. They are often misunderstood, sometimes dismissed, occasionally feared. Their vision separates them from collective illusion. They perceive unconscious agreements that hold social harmony together. Agreements not to look too closely, not to question too deeply, not to disturb the surface. The trauma-born empath, now becoming more aware, begins to recognize these silent contracts everywhere. You may notice that many interactions operate on avoidance. People maintain certain stories about themselves. They protect fragile identities. They project unwanted qualities onto others. And your heightened perception picks up on all of it. This creates what I call the loneliness of clarity. You may be physically present among others, yet inwardly distant. Conversations that once felt engaging now feel heavy. Not because you lack compassion, but because you sense the emotional subtext beneath every word. You feel the discrepancy between what is said and what is meant. This awareness can be exhausting in a new way. It is no longer simply emotional saturation, it is existential separation. And here lies a psychological danger. The psyche, overwhelmed by the constant perception of unconscious dynamics, may begin to retreat further. Not just from crowds, but from emotional engagement itself. You may find yourself instinctively avoiding certain environments. Loud gatherings, unresolved conflicts, emotionally chaotic relationships begin to feel intolerable. This is not weakness, it is regulation. The nervous system of the trauma-born empath has often been conditioned by prolonged unpredictability. It remains alert long after the original environment has changed. When exposed to intense emotional stimuli, it can shift into overwhelm or shutdown. You may experience sudden fatigue, mental fog, or a strong urge to withdraw without fully understanding why. The body participates in this process as much as the psyche. But if withdrawal continues without reflection, another risk emerges: detachment. There is a stage where empathy, once overwhelming, flips into numbness. You may appear calm. Others may describe you as composed or mature. But internally, something feels muted. The world loses its color. Emotional intensity fades, not only from others but from your own inner life. This is not individuation, it is protective disengagement. True individuation does not require you to shut down your sensitivity. It requires you to differentiate from it. You are not your hyperattunement. You are not your ability to detect nuance. These are functions of your psyche, not your essence. Here, a critical transformation must take place. The shift from unconscious empathy to conscious empathy. Unconscious empathy operates automatically. It absorbs without permission. It merges with the emotional field around it. It reacts before you are aware of reacting. Conscious empathy introduces choice. You perceive, but you decide how far to enter. You understand, but you do not automatically identify. You care, but you do not collapse into another's experience. For someone whose early survival depended on constant attunement, this shift can feel disorienting. The unconscious equates vigilance with safety. Letting go of hyperattunement feels like lowering a guard, but you are no longer the child who depended on reading every signal in order to survive. As an adult, you possess agency. You can choose your environment. You can leave harmful dynamics. You can establish boundaries. The unconscious, however, is slow to update its maps of reality. It continues to operate from earlier patterns long after circumstances have changed. This is why the trauma-born empath often feels suspended between past and present. Your current life may be stable, yet your internal responses still reflect old instability. To move forward, you must begin consciously teaching the psyche a new lesson. Perception does not require perpetual readiness for danger. This teaching begins with psychological boundaries, not walls, but differentiation. A boundary is not a rejection of others. It is a recognition of where you end and they begin. It allows you to observe someone's pain without carrying it, to witness someone's fear without absorbing it, to support without self-sacrifice. This does not diminish compassion, it refines it. Compassion rooted in unconscious merging leads to exhaustion. Compassion grounded in differentiation leads to sustainability. Yet this shift often disrupts existing relationships. When you stop absorbing automatically, when you pause before offering emotional labor, when you begin to say no without overwhelming guilt, some people will react. They may accuse you of becoming distant or selfish. They may attempt to re-establish the old equilibrium in which you functioned as their stabilizer. But what is actually being disrupted is an unconscious system. Relationships often form around unspoken roles. If your role was to regulate, soothe, anticipate, and carry, then changing that role forces the entire relational structure to reorganize. Not everyone will welcome that change. This can be profoundly isolating. You may grieve not only specific relationships, but the identity you once inhabited. The reliable one, the understanding one, the emotional anchor. As that identity dissolves, you may feel as though you are walking through unfamiliar psychological terrain. You are no longer defined primarily by others' needs. Yet your intrinsic identity has not fully stabilized. This is a transitional wilderness, but it is necessary. For the first time, you begin to encounter yourself without the constant overlay of relational function. And in that encounter, something unexpected emerges. Your own shadow. The shadow of the trauma-born empath often contains qualities long suppressed. Anger, resentment, assertiveness, self-interest. As a child, these emotions may have been unsafe to express. Harmony was necessary. Your role required accommodation, so these aspects were pushed into the unconscious. Now, as you individuate, they surface. You may feel anger toward those you endlessly supported. You may recognize patterns of self-sacrifice that no longer feel noble but draining. You may discover desires that contradict the persona of the endlessly available caregiver. Do not interpret this as moral decline. It is psychological integration. The shadow does not seek to destroy empathy. It seeks balance. Without the integration of anger, empathy becomes vulnerable to exploitation. Without assertiveness, compassion turns into self-erasure. As you begin integrating these disowned aspects, your empathy changes. It becomes discerning. You start distinguishing genuine need from manipulative demand. You pause before stepping in. You assess rather than react. This may unsettle others, but internally, a new stability begins to form. You are no longer oriented exclusively toward external emotional climates. You begin to sense an emerging inner axis, a psychological center that does not fluctuate with every surrounding mood. This anchoring is subtle but transformative. You can still perceive emotional currents, but they register as information rather than invasion. You witness without merging. You feel without dissolving. And in this state, something profound begins to unfold. Empathy no longer defines you. It becomes one capacity among many. You are not the perpetual stabilizer. You are not the emotional guardian of every room you enter. You are becoming an individual. In the next part, we will explore what happens when this inner center strengthens fully, when empathy evolves from adaptation into sovereignty. From survival to sovereignty. The individuated empath. When this transformation matures, it does not announce itself with drama. There is no grand revelation, no sudden spiritual spectacle. Instead, you begin to notice something quiet but unmistakable. You are no longer carried away by what you perceive. Empathy no longer happens to you. It becomes something you have. This marks the emergence of psychological sovereignty. In earlier stages, your perception was automatic. Emotional information entered your awareness without invitation. You absorbed atmospheres, tensions, unspoken fears. Now there is space between perception and identification. You sense, but you do not merge. You understand, but you do not internalize. This space changes everything. You remain sensitive, perhaps even more perceptive than before. But your center holds. There is a steadiness that does not collapse under emotional intensity. You can sit with another person's pain without feeling compelled to fix it. You can observe conflict without being drawn into its gravity. This is not detachment in the cold sense. It is differentiated presence. Most people lean to one extreme. They are either highly empathic and easily overwhelmed or strongly defended and emotionally distant. The individuated empath holds both capacities at once, deep sensitivity and firm boundaries. That integration is rare. Others may begin to respond differently to you. Some will feel unusually safe in your presence. They may find themselves speaking truths they have never voiced before. They sense that you are attentive without being intrusive, receptive without being consuming. At the same time, there is something unmistakably solid about you. You no longer emit unconscious signals of emotional availability that invite dependency. Your boundaries are clear, even when unspoken. This combination, openness without surrender, reshapes your relational world. The loneliness that once accompanied your sensitivity also transforms. It does not disappear completely because individuation always contains an element of solitude. But its quality changes. It is no longer the ache of not being understood. It becomes the quiet fullness of inner companionship. You are alone, not because you are excluded, but because you have discovered a relationship with yourself that is sufficient. From this inner completeness, connection becomes choice rather than necessity. You engage with others not to regulate yourself, not to secure belonging, but to genuinely relate. Your perception of humanity deepens as well. You begin to see archetypal patterns unfolding beneath individual behavior. You recognize the frightened child within the aggressive adult. You sense the longing beneath pride. You see how projection, fear, and unintegrated shadow shape conflicts, both personal and collective. But these insights no longer destabilize you. They inform your response rather than dictate it. Perhaps the most healing shift occurs in your relationship to your own past. The trauma that once defined your hyperattunement becomes integrated into your narrative. It is no longer an open wound. It becomes part of your psychological history, something that shaped your perception but no longer governs your identity. You can look back and see how the psyche adapted intelligently, how it developed refined awareness to navigate instability, how what once felt like vulnerability also cultivated depth. This is not romanticizing suffering, it is integrating it. Integration means the past no longer unconsciously dictates the present. The survival strategies remain accessible as knowledge, but they are no longer automatic reactions. You choose when to engage your perceptive intensity. It does not control you. And from this position, empathy evolves again. It ceases to be merely personal. It becomes a lens for understanding collective dynamics. You begin to notice how fear drives group behavior, how unexamined shadow manifests in social movements, how unconscious complexes shape culture and history. Your sensitivity expands beyond interpersonal interactions into a broader psychological awareness. Yet with this expansion often comes humility. The more clearly you see, the more you recognize the vastness of the unconscious. You understand that perception is never complete. Human complexity remains inexhaustible. This humility protects you from arrogance. You do not stand above humanity, you stand within it. Empathy at this stage becomes creative rather than reactive. Instead of absorbing suffering, you illuminate patterns. Instead of stabilizing chaos externally, you embody internal coherence. Your presence itself becomes grounding, not because you carry others, but because you remain centered. You demonstrate quietly that it is possible to be sensitive without being fragile, to be perceptive without being consumed, to be compassionate without self-erasure. This is why so few complete this journey fully. It requires enduring disillusionment without cynicism, integrating the shadow without denial, tolerating solitude without rushing back into unconscious roles, releasing identities that once provided meaning, allowing old structures to dissolve before new ones fully form. Many turn back. They retreat into numbness, or they cling to the identity of the perpetual caregiver, or they avoid the confrontation with their own anger and unmet needs. But those who continue discover something no external success can provide, an inner axis that remains stable regardless of outer turbulence. From this axis, empathy becomes strength. You are no longer merely a survivor of emotional instability. You are an individuated self, one whose sensitivity serves consciousness rather than compulsion. The wounded seer transforms into the integrated witness. You still feel deeply. You still perceive nuance. But you are not defined by what you endure. You are defined by what you integrate. And perhaps the final realization is this: your early hyperattunement was never the end of your story. It was the beginning. It was the psyche's first attempt to protect you. Individuation is its mature expression. When survival evolves into sovereignty, empathy becomes neither burden nor armor. It becomes clarity. And from that clarity, you can stand in the complexity of human life without losing yourself. Aware of its wounds, its contradictions, its shadow, and its extraordinary capacity for growth. This is the quiet power of the individuated empath. Not the power to absorb the world, but the power to remain whole within it.